The U.S. government this week announced certain measures it will be applying to counter China's growing influence on Africa. Don't forget, it was this year that China announced it would be providing $60 billion in financial support to Africa to come in the form of government assistance and investment. As many analysts have said, China has penetrated many aspects of relations with the continent, and the United States may just be playing catch-up.
China's latest whopping $60 billion investment in Africa, if utilized properly by leaders, should indeed bring the continent up to some level comparable to other nations outside of Africa. $20 billion in credit lines, $15 billion has been signed to grants, interest-free loans and concessional loans, and $10 billion in investment financing. This deal was made this year, but it will not be the first for China. Back in 2015, President Xi Jinping made a similar pledge to Africa, announcing that a $60 billion pledge had either been delivered or that arrangements were being made for deliveries. One quarter of all Chinese investment is found in Nigeria and in Angola. Nigeria being one of China's largest investment partners, 5 of the $60 billion pledged at the China-Africa conference in 2015 was dedicated to Nigeria. Plus, Nigeria has received large funds from China for railways, the line from Lagos to Kano, and the coastal railway from Lagos to Calabar. On the other hand, U.S. investment in Africa has been focused on aid programs, primarily healthcare and education.
Mr. President, quick question about Michael Flynn. As you know,
The U.S. mission in Nigeria this year announced additional aid to support good governance and health in Nigeria, bringing the figure up to $1.1 billion in the 5-year Development Objectives Agreement in the country. During the present U.S. administration, America has failed to outline any kind of serious, long-term agenda for engagement with Africa, leaving the continent wondering about the future of U.S.-African partnership. Former U.S. Ambassador to Nigeria, Robin Sanders, in an interview earlier this year, said America had seemingly ignored Africa, leaving the continent no choice but to turn to China, though she warned African leaders to be wary of the relationship.
You know, there's a huge chapter in my book where I talk about the China factor in Africa, and I was just at the U.S. Confucius Center as well. And my view is, you know, China's relationship with Africa or vice versa, that's between the continent and China in terms of how you want to define that relationship for yourself as a nation. I have absolutely no problem with the strategic partnerships, the engagement. I actually think China is doing a very good job of focusing on infrastructure development, what they're doing in East Africa, building railroads and things that we don't do, and it's our fault that we're not doing those. So I'm not in that corner. I know there are Americans who, you know, have that viewpoint. I'm not one of those. I think I always give China credit for its involvement, for its leadership. I'm not saying that everything they do I agree with, but I certainly think they have a deeper viewpoint on how they want to engage, and they look like they're engaged for the long term. And we don't have that perception here, and I'd like to see us change that.
Has contributed so much to the public
So,
policy debate.
did National Security Advisor John Bolton's new Africa strategy address the issues?
And the strategic use of debt.
According to him, the strategy will focus on 3 priorities: enhancing U.S. trade and commercial ties with African nations through arrangements that benefited both the United States and Africa, countering the threat of Islamic terrorism, specifically ISIS, Al-Qaeda, and their affiliates that operate and recruit on the African continent, plotting attacks against American citizens and targets, and finally, ensuring that the U.S. allocates its foreign assistance efficiently and effectively to advance U.S. interests, and that the United States will no longer provide indiscriminate assistance across the entire continent without focus or prioritization, and will no longer support unproductive, unsuccessful, and unaccountable UN peacekeeping missions. So, could National Security Advisor John Bolton's warning provide answers, but not without a warning against China and Russia?
Great power competitors namely China and Russia, are rapidly expanding their financial and political influence across Africa. They are deliberately and aggressively targeting their investments in the region to gain a competitive advantage over the United States. China uses bribes, opaque agreements, and the strategic use of debt to hold states in Africa captive to Beijing's wishes and demands. Its investment ventures are riddled with corruption and do not meet the same environmental or ethical standards as U.S. developmental programs.
I wanted to know how that work fits into